From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome once again to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors around the world. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and art historian living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. So, in this and several episodes to come, I'm going to explore a topic long overdue here on The Sculptor's Funeral. After more than 70 episodes of discussion on the Western European tradition in figurative sculpture, I'm finally, just now, getting around to talking about the real roots of that tradition, the sculptors and sculpture in the time and place that started it all, ancient Greece. Now, longtime listeners to the podcast have heard me link the sculpture of the Renaissance, the Romantic tradition, and Neoclassicism to notions of the classical ideal. I've talked about canons of proportion, about idealization, and about classicism, and how these relate to the production of sculpture that adheres to the classical ideal. It's obvious that everything seems to have started for us with Greece. But why? Why do the roots of our tradition begin in Greece and not in Egypt or the Persian Empire? Why is it that what occurred in art 2,500 years ago in Greece happens to be the beginning of an artistic tradition which survived and often thrived for the 2,500 years that followed? What was so special about Greek art that distinguished it from the art in other cultures at the time? In short, why Greece? Well, the answer, it turns out, is a simple one. I can answer it, in fact, in 3 words, and I will, but not yet. First, I'm going to cover the basic background and underlying complexities to this seemingly simple answer in order to show just how unique and revolutionary that simple answer really is. Now, it seems sort of crazy that I haven't gotten to the Greeks until now. Though I can explain that very simply. It's because until I started studying for this series of podcasts, I felt like I didn't know a great deal about ancient Greece and the sculpture and sculptors of that time. At least, not enough to be able to present a cogent story of that time and place. Which is not to say that I haven't been interested in the Greeks. It's just that, I'm interested in a lot of things, and the Greeks have finally made it to the top of my list. They've been there for a while, actually, but I've had to do a ton of studying before I could formulate my approach for the podcast. And I think I'm ready. Though there is the chance I might make a few mistakes and a few presumptions along the way, and I hope that if I do, a listener who knows better than me will let me know so that I can correct the error. I welcome any assistance in getting it right. And speaking of assistance, even though I have actually been to places like Athens and Olympia and Crete and other places in Greece, I found it very helpful to have a map in front of me when reading and thinking about this distant time and place. And I think you'll find it helpful too. So if you can, go right now to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on the image gallery link at the top of the homepage, and then go to episode 75, Why Greece? And you'll have at your fingertips a handy visual reference in the form of a few maps which will clarify some ideas as I talk about them. To make it even easier, I'll also post all the maps for each episode at the Sculptor's Funeral Facebook page, so you'll find them in the comments section of each episode posting. So if you don't know where the Persian Empire was located, or can't picture in your head where Athens is in relation to Sparta, well, you're going to need some maps. The geography of Greece played a huge role in the history of the Greeks, and it's something that is best understood, of course, with a map. They really do clarify things. And maybe the geography of Greece is a good place to start our discussion. Now, if you take a look at the first map, map number 1, you can follow along. Now, basically, the region of the Mediterranean that we call Greece is made up of primarily mountains and water. Greece has an enormous amount of coastline for its size, and dozens of islands. Moving in from the coast, what land there is dominated by mountain ranges, and these ranges divide Greece into several plains and valleys, but it's mostly mountains. The soil is generally poor, and it's not very suitable for the development of large-scale agrarian societies. Now, these geographical factors, as I say, played a huge role in the history of Greece. Mountains and coastlines and islands, these are all borders. They are barriers. The cities that developed over Greece were naturally isolated one from another, and this led to the development of hundreds of independent city-states with local political structures, local identities, local customs, rather than there being a monolithic political and social structure which spanned the entire region. A Greek city-state was called a polis, and that's where we get the words politics, metropolis, and so on. For most of the history of ancient Greece, there was no one ruler over everything. Athens was a sovereign polis, as was Sparta, Olympia, Pylos, Mycenae, and Thebes, and many others. They were independent and went to war with each other or formed alliances with each other as needed. Another consequence of geography was that the Greek people were seafarers and traders. They had to be. The soil just wasn't good enough nor plentiful enough to sustain large populations in the city-states. The larger and more prosperous of the city-states had to import grain and other goods, and it was common for a polis to set up colonies in more fertile land overseas for the production of agriculture, as well as to facilitate trade. Because of this, Greek culture and language often became a de facto export to other areas of the Mediterranean, and, in turn, Greek culture was exposed to the art and culture of Egypt and Assyria, Phoenicia, Persia, and many others. But despite the physical isolation of one polis from another, and despite outside influences from foreign lands, the Greek city-states were able to share between them more or less common economic structures and languages, religious beliefs, and cultural practices. Thus, we can speak of societies as distinct as Athens and Sparta as both being Greek, even though they were politically separate entities who were often at war with each other. Ancient Greece was a culture, not a nation. The name the Greeks called their land, back in ancient times, and they still do today, is Hellada, or Hellas. And when historians speak of the time before Greece had a distinctly Greek culture and identity, they call that time the pre-Hellenic period. This was a long, long time ago, stretching all the way back to the Neolithic era, several thousand years BC, until about 1200 BC. It's a huge stretch of history, and a lot of things happened during this time that would later influence Greek art and culture. Things like the famous Trojan War, which centuries later would become the subject of the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The city-state of Mycenae was dominant on the mainland of Greece during the pre-Hellenic period, while the Cyclades, the group of islands between Greece and Asia Minor, were dominated by the Cycladic culture. And during this time there was also the rise and destruction of the Minoan culture on the island of Crete. Basically, much of what evolved into the myths and religion of the Greeks later on had their origins during this time period. And this includes the origins of the pantheon of Greek gods residing on Mount Olympus, to the legends of the Minotaur, Ulysses, Agamemnon, Achilles, and all the other Greek heroes and villains. But by 1100 BC, the Mycenaean, Cycladic, and Minoan cultures, as well as most of the other cultures in the Mediterranean, had collapsed due to invasions from northern European tribes, as well as natural disasters, and Greece fell into a dark age of illiteracy and disorganization. It's only after about 800 BC that the cities of Greece got back on their feet and started to develop into the powerful and prosperous city-states we are more familiar with. Greeks relearned the technology of writing from the Phoenicians, who dominated Mediterranean trade at the time, and adapted the Phoenician script into the Greek alphabet. And here is where, or maybe I should say when, we will begin our examination of Greek sculpture, at the end of the pre-Hellenic period, and we're going to do that by looking at what sculpture was before it came to be what we recognize as classically and uniquely Greek. Now, looking at the second map I made for this episode, which shows the eastern Mediterranean at around 800 BC, we can see that the Greek city-states are far from alone, and they're not the only ones producing sculpture. To Greece's north lie the territories of the Dacians, the Thracians, and the Illyrians, and to the east of Greece You have that land mass which separates the Mediterranean Sea from the Black Sea, which we call Asia Minor, or Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey. Now, on Asia Minor, in 800 BC, you've got the Ionians, the Lydians, and the Phrygians. And then down the coast of the eastern side of the Mediterranean, which we call the Levant, where we find present-day Israel and Syria and Palestine and Lebanon, you have the Assyrian Empire, the first true empire in world history, which dominated Mesopotamia. And finally, on the north coast of Africa, we have the Kingdom of Egypt, which had been producing sculpture for thousands of years before classical Greece existed. In the year 800 BC, Greece was a fairly minor player in trade and cultural influence. And what sort of art were they producing in Greece in 800 BC, as Greece emerged from its dark ages? What little sculpture we have from this time comes mostly in the form of small figurines of people and animals in terracotta and stone. It's basically along the lines of folk art, rather than being an art tradition marked by any sort of unified style or particular skill. These small sculptures were most likely votive offerings, which are gifts to the gods left at temples and shrines in exchange for divine favor of one sort or another, or to give thanks to the gods. Now, art historians call this period of early Greece the geometric period, because of the geometric designs found on the pottery of the time. See, pottery is basically the dominant artifact from this period, not so much sculpture. But then things start to take off around 700 BC, when a more definite and widespread style begins to emerge in these little votive figures. Heads are notably triangular, torsos are rhomboids, waistlines are tiny. Hairstyles seem like wigs, but the similarity in the patterns of these hairstyles indicate a learned tradition. And these figures also seem to carry a little bit more significance, as we start to find larger or even life-sized examples carved in stone and marble. These statues basically come in two forms. There's the male and the female. Now, the males are nude for the most part, while the females have long dresses. Both types are rigidly frontal, with arms at their sides attached to the thighs, and their feet are close together. And although it's evident that these statues are influenced by the work of several Mesopotamian cultures, it's the first style of figurative sculpture we can ascribe directly to the Greeks. And this period is known as the Daedalic period, named after Daedalus, the father of Icarus in the famous Greek myth. Now, in the mythology of Daedalus, he was known as an inventor. Living on Crete, he was commissioned by King Minos to build the labyrinth, the maze in which the Minotaur was kept. After, he and his son Icarus were imprisoned by Minos in order to keep the secret of the labyrinth a secret. And it's from their high prison tower that Daedalus and Icarus make their escape by constructing wings made of feathers and wax. In addition to that, Daedalus is credited with the invention of carpentry and of all the tools you need for woodworking, like the saw, the plumb line, and glue. And on top of all this, he is said to have been a sculptor. But not just any sculptor, the first sculptor of large figures, figures which were so lifelike that, were they not chained down, they would walk away. Now, people started referring to this earliest period of Greek sculpture as Daedalic only in the 19th century. But people had been attributing these old triangle head statues to Daedalus himself since classical antiquity. And here's where I should introduce Pausanias, a Greek writer living in the 1st century AD, who wrote a travel guide to Greece, a first-hand account of many of the most important sites in classical antiquity. His book is one of the most important and reliable pieces of information we have, which provides first-hand information and insight into the classical world. You can kind of think of him as ancient Greece's Giorgio Vasari. We'll be hearing from Pausanias in the next several episodes, to be sure. Now, in one passage, as Pausanias describes his tour of the ancient city of Corinth, he mentions, quote, "The sanctuary of Athena Kalonitis is by the theater of Corinth, and near it is a naked wooden image of Heracles, said to be by Daedalus. All the works of this artist, though somewhat uncouth to look at, nevertheless have a touch of the divine in them." Unquote. So it's interesting. Here we find an assumption on the part of Pausanias that Daedalus was, in fact, a historical sculptor and not just the stuff of legend. And sure, there may have been a sculptor from that time period known as Daedalus, but in Pausanias' time, almost all of the existing sculpture from this period were attributed to Daedalus, based on their stylistic similarities. But let's get back to that rather fun idea that the sculptures of Daedalus were so lifelike they might walk away if they weren't restrained. It was a pretty common anecdote, apparently. Plato mentions this magical ability of these statues, and the playwright Euripides does as well. Another Greek writer in the 4th century BC, Polyphetus, wrote a book called Tales of the Incredible, a book in which he debunks several common myths and legends. Now, Polyphetus had this to say about the walking statues of Daedalus. Quote, "It is said about Daedalus that he made statues that walked of their own accord. This seems impossible to me, that statues should move about spontaneously. The truth is this. In those days, the sculptors of gods and men made the feet joined together, and the arms hanging by the sides. Daedalus first made one foot striding forward, which is why men said, Daedalus has made this statue walk." Unquote. So that's kind of an interesting theory, and it could well be based in fact, because it was right around this time that Greek sculptors did indeed break away, as much as they could, from a strict frontal and neutral composition and place one leg, almost always the left leg, in a forward position, giving the impression that the figure has taken a step forward. Now, placing a leg in a slightly forward position may seem like a pretty timid first step, pun intended, towards more naturalistic composition. But it must be remembered that many of these figures were large, freestanding statues, and many of them carved in stone. Now, as we know, human figures in a dense material like stone are very bad at supporting their own weight. They easily crack just above the ankles where the legs are thinnest. Sculptors quickly learned to incorporate a tree trunk or a bit of drapery or some other device to give the figure a third leg, as we call them. But in the Daedalic period, this idea had not yet occurred, apparently. So any composition that would throw the figure into a pose that was less than perfectly balanced would not have lasted for very long. Moving one foot forward was about as far as a sculptor dared to go, or so it seems. Now, whether or not there was a sculptor named Daedalus who was the first in Greece to put one foot forward in his statues, he certainly did not invent the pose. The Egyptians had been doing exactly the same thing with their figures for almost 2,000 years. The statue of the pharaoh Menkaura, carved into dark limestone, was made around 2400 BC and exhibits the same walking pose that we find in the Daedalic period in 650 BC. This Egyptian Menkaura statue is doubly impressive because it's actually a two-figure composition, with the pharaoh's wife at his side and in the same pose. But not only do we find this pose in Egyptian art in 2400 BC, that pose persists throughout the history of the kingdoms of Egypt, right up to the point it was presumably copied by the Greeks in the Daedalic period. So here's a question. So if the Egyptians were covering ground in 2400 BC that the Greeks had reached only in about 650 BC or so, why didn't the Egyptians become the artistic root of European figurative sculpture? And why didn't that happen centuries sooner? Why was Egyptian work seemingly stagnant for so long, never evolving into anything approaching the poses we see in the classical Greek tradition, as we will see happening in Greece just 2 centuries after the Daedalic period? It's kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, what took the Greeks 200 years to accomplish, the Egyptians didn't do or couldn't do in 2,000 years. What gives? Well, I'll tell you when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey everybody, welcome back. I missed you. I hope everyone has had a good summer and you're all looking forward to the autumn. So it's been close to 4 months since the last episode came out because of all the traveling I've been doing since mid-March to just about a month ago. But travel season is now over for me, and I'm excited to be getting back to the podcast and into new topics. The next several episodes will be out a little bit more quickly than I've been doing them lately. In fact, as of right now, as I'm recording episode 75, I've already got the next episode prepared. Number 76 is ready to record, and I'm already working on episode 77. And I'll be releasing these new episodes just once a month. And the reason I'm going to be stockpiling episodes like this is that my schedule just gets busier and busier. So I'm sort of saving up for the winter, for when I'll have no spare time at all. And even though I've just finished with my travel workshops for the year, I need to start working on next year's travel season. So if you have a studio or work at a teaching institution, or you just think you could throw together a bunch of artists and run out a workspace for a week, go ahead and get in touch if you would like me to come and give a workshop or a demo or even just a lecture. I've already lined up several new venues for next summer in places that I haven't been before, and I'm always looking for more new venues. And of course, whenever I'm not traveling, you can always stop by and visit me in my Florence studio, or even come and study with me here as well. And now back to the podcast. So, the Egyptians. I could do a whole podcast episode, I think, on Egyptian sculpture, and maybe I will someday. And despite ancient Egypt's nearly 3,000-year history, it probably would still only require a single episode to cover it all. Historians have always been astounded at just how little art changed or evolved during all that time. The artistic traditions were nothing if not conservative. So what were the Egyptians up to? Now, when we think of Egyptian art, the first image that might spring to mind might be of hieroglyphs written on a wall, surrounding painted figures in their iconic Egyptian poses that somehow show both the front and the profile of the figure at the same time. Hieroglyphic script in Egypt is as old as Egyptian culture itself, with examples of that writing going back to 3200 BC. Hieroglyphs are logographic, which means they're picture writing. Simplified images stand for letters and words. And just like in our Phoenician alphabet we use today, in order for our writing to be understood, we need to form our letters in a predetermined way that our culture has agreed upon, right? Because, if you think you're clever and have a totally new and improved way of writing out the letter A, well, good luck to you, and getting other people to understand what you've written is a substitute for the standard letter A, right? The foundation of legibility is recognizable and agreed upon symbol. In our alphabet of only 26 phonemes, recognition is a pretty easy task. But in logographic writing systems, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, there may be thousands of individual symbols in common use, and one has to be very precise and regular when one writes them out, right? Sometimes only a single dot or a slash can completely change the meaning of a hieroglyph. Too much fluidity in the way people wrote would soon lead to a breakdown in written communication. So Egyptian painting evolved right alongside their writing system, and painting in Egypt was used much like their writing system. Both served to record and illustrate the lives of their gods and their kings. Just as in their writing system, images of specific people and gods evolved to have specific physical characteristics when depicted. The Egyptian religion was polytheistic, so there's lots of gods who reigned over various aspects of life. You've got a sun god, a rain god, a god of crops and fields, a god of the underworld, and so on. And so when these gods were represented in art, they were more or less in the shape of people, but often depicted as having the heads of animals. So Anubis is the jackal-headed god, Horus has the head of a falcon, and on it goes. Now, if some gods like Isis had a regular human head, she would still be shown holding certain items or wearing certain headdresses, which would identify her. In giving a god the head of an animal, the point was not to imply they literally had a falcon head. It was done to ensure that the god would not be mistaken for an ordinary human being, right? They were supernatural, literally forces of nature. And so when they're rendered in art, they must look like something from another plane of existence. Their depiction was not literal, it was symbolic. But it didn't just stop with identifying gods. Each pharaoh had their own look as well. And slaves were also instantly recognizable as such, as were other people in different classes and occupations. And the reason they were instantly recognizable is because they were depicted in a predetermined and agreed upon way, a very, very uniform way spread throughout the culture. It can be argued that the extreme stasis of Egyptian art was its virtue rather than its weakness. Artists were valued in Egypt according to how perfectly they could repeat the established forms. And the legacy those countless generations of artists left us is one of the longest lived and most purposeful periods in art history. So that explains why the Egyptians didn't evolve to become the grandfathers of figurative sculpture. But it doesn't explain why or how the Greeks did. This isn't to say that the Egyptians didn't influence early Greek art. After all, it's no coincidence that Daedalus and his walking sculptures appear in Greece in the middle of the 7th century, because that's just when the Greeks started trading heavily with the Egyptians. Now, when we look at Greek sculpture from around 600 BC, we may in fact mistake it for Egyptian work. It's very similar. But really, what we find in 600 BC is an evolution from Greek Daedalic sculpture with a large dose of Egyptian influence thrown in. And this creates a distinct style in its own right. And today, we call that style the Archaic Greek style. And this is the period between 600 and about 480 BC, basically the entire 6th century BC. And to me, here's where the good stuff begins, in the Archaic period. The Greeks were in no way bound up by the rigid traditions of the Egyptians, and so they could borrow styles and motifs and walking poses and whatnot and adapt them for their own purposes. And some of these purposes will be familiar, such as honoring and illustrating the gods or creating figures as votive offerings. But then some purposes for archaic sculpture were entirely Greek. And in particular, we see an evolution of those two earlier Daedalic figure types, the male and the female standing figures, otherwise known as the Kuros and the Kore. Now, Kuros in Greek means youth, young man. And it also implies a sort of a noble young man, a young man of noble birth or some other laudable quality. A fine young man, I guess might be the best translation for the word Kuros. And Kore, well, it's the same thing, but for a fine young woman. So Kuros for man and Kore for woman. And as with the earlier Daedalic forms, the male statues were nude and the female ones were dressed. Now, kuroi, which is the plural of Kuros, kuroi were used for many things. Quite often they were meant as depictions of the god Apollo, who was also known as the Megistor Kuros, or the greatest Kuros. But kuroi could also represent living or dead people. They served as funerary monuments, for example, and we have found hundreds of kuroi in the ruins of various temples dedicated to Apollo, evidently left there as votive offerings. Let's take a look at two kuroi that are sort of standout examples of early archaic sculpture. They were two kuroi mounted to a single base, and they've been identified as Cleobis and Beton. Now, before we get into who Cleobis and Beton were, let's just look at the statues themselves. Just hop on over to the image gallery and check them out. Now, anyone familiar with Egyptian art can certainly see their influence in Cleobis and Beton. Like Egyptian work, they are frontally posed, with the left leg extended, and even with shoulder-length hair that seems to vaguely resemble an Egyptian pharaoh's headdress. And they're carved life-size in stone. But these aren't totally influenced by the Egyptians. One Greek contribution to archaic sculpture is that, of course, the male figures, are generally nude, unlike the Egyptians. And another Greek originality lies in the rendering of the mouth into a smiling expression. Now, this smile is so prevalent in archaic work that it's actually become known as the archaic smile, and it's a dead giveaway for the archaic period. So, if you want to impress your friends next time you're in a museum, as soon as you see from across the room an ancient Greek statue with a smile, just be all casual and say, "Oh yeah, that looks 6th century to me," and you're probably going to be correct. Anyway, Cleobis and Beton are very, very typical of early archaic work, made around 580 BC. And it's not just the pose that is borrowed from the Egyptians, but the proportions of the figures are Egyptian as well. Now, the Egyptian sculptors and painters had very precise canons of proportion which they used to render their figures in their famously consistent way. To be exact, Egyptian figures at that time conformed to proportions derived from dividing the figure into 21 1/4 parts, going from the sole of the foot to the center of the eye. And studies have shown that, at least in the early part of the Archaic period, the Greeks were more or less adhering to this strangely divided canon of the Egyptians. So, who were Cleobis and Beton? Well, according to legend, they were the happiest boys in the world. The legend has it that these two twin brothers were both champion athletes, strong and young and beautiful. And one day their mother wished to go pray at the temple of the goddess Hera, but could not walk there. Unable to buy oxen to pull the cart that would carry their mother to the temple, Cleobis and Beton harnessed themselves to the cart and pulled their mother to the temple themselves. And when she got to the temple, their mother prayed to Hera that Hera would award her sons for their devotion to their mother. And that night, Hera did just that, by causing Cleobis and Beton to die peacefully in their sleep. Yeah, kind of thanks for that, Hera. Thanks for the death. But this story actually illustrates a very important facet of Greek culture and values at the time. See, dying in your prime, when you're young and beautiful and at the height of your power, now that was considered an excellent way to go, second only to being young and beautiful and dying in battle. Cleobis and Beton died a happy death, according to the Greek legend. These votive statues were, possibly made and given to the temple of Apollo, perhaps in honor of a young man devoted to his family, who had died young. But who really knows? But this notion, this value of dying in your prime, before your body is ravaged by the effects of aging, was a part of a value system that was peculiar to the Greeks of the day. A value system which today we characterize as a cult of beauty. Now, the so-called cult of beauty in ancient Greece was a cultural value system that seems to have originated with the Olympic Games, which were started way back in 776 BC, 2 centuries before the Archaic period. Now, it might seem like such a shallow idea, right? I mean, to base a cultural value system off of being good at sports and having a fit body. But there is much more to it than that. Now, let's take a quick look at these ancient sporting events and get a true sense of what they were really all about. It would be difficult to underestimate the importance of the Olympic Games in the ancient world. Their very occurrence, happening once every 4 years, became a unit of time measurement in Greece. We read Pausanias talking about things which occurred in the 35th Olympiad, for instance, or the 42nd Olympiad. It was literally how they marked time. Wars fought in Greece would go into an automatic truce when the games occurred, so that competitors from each side of a battle might also compete in the games. But the Olympic Games were not just the greatest sporting event ever. It was, at least at first, primarily a religious festival, celebrating the god Zeus. And the whole thing grew out of a peculiar religious practice at the temple of Hera at Olympia. You see, every year, a new high priestess was chosen to administrate at the temple, and the new priestess was chosen by means of a foot race. So the first Olympic Games were run only by women, which is ironic, since after the Games expanded into a pan-Hellenic phenomenon, women were banned entirely from competition. Now, the logic of awarding a priesthood on the basis of winning a foot race is actually quite simple. The gods would determine who would win the foot race. No woman the gods wouldn't want serving them could possibly be allowed by those gods to win, right? Ipso facto, superior ability is a sign of divine favor. Now, this idea of superior ability as a sign of divine favor, it really took hold in the Greek mentality. Hence the importance of the games, and not just on a personal level, and not just on a religious level, but also on the level of city-state politics. The Olympic Games were a de facto political summit where alliances could be forged based on how each city-state fared in the games. A successful city-state at the games was viewed as having been awarded the divine favor of the gods, and this could have real political repercussions. Champion athletes were traded between the city-states and used as collateral or bargaining chips or ransom. And between the citizens of a city-state, the Olympic Games were about much more than just being good at sports. The military success of a city-state depended to a significant degree upon having a large number of fit young men. And so the development and the encouragement of a cult of male beauty, a beauty which was defined by an athletic build, well, it just makes perfect sense. It was a practical way to bolster the security of your homeland, and it was far from an exercise in hedonism or shallowness, as many mistakenly believe today. The Olympic Games were the most important games festival in Greece, but they were far from the only one. The Pan-Athenaic Games, for instance, were held in Athens in honor of their patron goddess Athena, and it was open only to men from Athenian territory. Many of the games played there were the ones found at Olympus, but there were also other contests held at the Pan-Athenaic Games, which were more specific to Athens. There were boat races and equestrian events, as well as music and poetry competitions. And there was a beauty contest. Now, this was a competition known as euandria, which translates into manliness. And Athens wasn't the only city to award such prizes in beauty competitions. Remember, this wasn't like a beauty contest today. These had real purposes. To recognize those favored by the gods, which was a very real concern in Greek daily life, and to encourage society as a whole to strive towards peak physical form, which would curry divine favor for the city-state as a whole. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, of course. I mean, the more fit guys you have in a society, the better able they're going to be able to overcome their foes in battle. In the confined and resource-poor territories of Greece, war was just a constant fact of life. The cult of beauty was, in fact, an effective survival mechanism. Now, some historians think that the vital importance of the cult of beauty in Athens is also what indirectly led to the rise of pederasty as a commonplace there. Grown men admiring the physiques of young boys and taking on the role of lover/mentor was not just accepted, but expected in Athenian life. But the cult of male beauty never lost its spiritual connotation. The idea that something beautiful equals something good, something connected with the gods, took deep, deep root in the Greek psyche. This philosophy of beauty equaling goodness had a name, kalokagathia, beautiful goodness. So with the cult of beauty in mind, let's go back to the subject of the Kuros, the fine young man statue, and talk more about its many uses. Now, we've seen how it can be used as a commemorative work or votive work, as in the Cleobis and Beton statues. But now let's take a look at its other main purpose, the other main purpose of the Kuros, that of representing a god. Now, the archaic Kuros has always been linked to one god in particular, the god of fine young men, Apollo. And there's a physical link as well, because even when a kuroi was made to represent mere mortals, they shared Apollo's signature hairstyle, which was shoulder-length, free-flowing hair. Now, we know of this conception of Apollo from ancient poems, which describe Apollo, well, for instance, in one instance, he's described as, quote, the form of a man, brisk and sturdy, in the prime of youth, while his broad shoulders were covered with his hair. But it wasn't just Apollo that looked like a fine young man. We read in just about everywhere, in Homeric epics and elsewhere, we read of the other gods being described as looking more or less just like people, at least when the gods weren't trying to trick people by taking the forms of animals. But the Greek gods' sort of default appearance, that was the human form. And that fact, as minor as it may seem, is another significant factor, perhaps the most significant factor, in the development of the uniquely Greek classical tradition, and therefore the tradition of European sculpture. Greek gods looked like people. One of the oldest questions in art is, how do you depict your gods? Now, even if you could know what they looked like, how could you do divinity justice in your art? I've already mentioned how the Egyptians handled it. The gods were given supernatural characteristics, like the heads of jackals or cats. Now, this was done for identification, but also to imply that divine forms were beyond the powers of mortals to depict. Now, the Assyrians had the same issue as the Egyptians. The Assyrians had no problem depicting minor deities and spirits like genies, or the fantastical Lamassu, which is a winged bull with a man's head, which is iconic in Assyrian art. The Lamassu represents a protective spirit, much like the Sphinx over in Egypt. Not really a god, more like just a spirit, like angels and saints are in Christianity. Operators on the spiritual plane, but not rulers of it. But when it came to depicting the gods themselves, the Assyrians chose to depict their gods only through the use of abstract symbol. The idea of God was just too big and complex to tackle in art, it seems, too fraught with the possibility of error or heresy. And some cultures took this idea even further, like the ancient Israelites, who felt that a representation of images of God led to the destruction of the divine presence, and was therefore strictly forbidden. And in the Jewish religion, it remains forbidden. On Asia Minor, in the 6th century, a new empire was emerging that would subsume and subsequently dwarf the Assyrian Empire, and this was the Persian Empire. And in the Persian religion, not only did they not represent gods at all, they didn't even build them temples or altars. As Pausanias correctly pointed out, the Persians, quote, did not believe the gods to share the same nature with men, as we Greeks imagine, unquote. Indeed, it seems only the Greeks at this time imagined their gods to look just like they did. Or, I should say, almost just like they did. Of course, the Greek gods would have to be perfect iterations of what the human form could be, Apollo being the Megistor Kuros, the greatest of the young men, for example. So the gods were perfection in physical form. But there was little in the Greek collective psyche which forbid them from believing that this perfection in form may not be reached by the artists of the day. So, with all this in mind, the cult of beauty, the anthropomorphism of the gods, let's turn back to the Archaic period in sculpture and take a look at how sculpture progresses over time, from about the year 600 to about 480. Now, during that time, art historians detect no less than 6 different stylistic phases, or evolutions, if you will, of the Kuros. We're only going to take a look at just 3 of those phases. And let me just say that comparing one Kuros to another and sort of tracing a line of development is actually a pretty easy task, due to the fact that each and every Kuros takes the same pose. It's that frontal pose with the arms at the side and the left foot forward. It's really one of the few instances in art history where you can really compare apples to apples. However, that doesn't hold true with the Kore statues, the female figures. Their dresses were often elaborate and varied, and presumably these female statues had a decorative function that wasn't evident with the male Kuros statues. So to keep it simple, I'm just going to be comparing the male Kuroi. Now, the earliest archaic style, from, say, 620 BC to 580 BC, this style is illustrated by the Cleobis and Beton statues, and also in the so-called New York Kuros. It's a life-size Kuros, which you'll find in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And these are the Kuroi which most resemble Egyptian work. They're heavily schematic and stylized. Certain anatomical features are clearly indicated, though usually with little subtlety or individuality. Other anatomical features might be conspicuously absent. It's sort of hit and miss, really. But then, in the middle of the 6th century, around 540 BC, we see a definite change. First of all, the proportions have changed significantly, and they appear to be based more on real human proportion rather than the Egyptian system. Heads are smaller and rounder, necks are the right length, arms are the right length, and the anatomical detail has taken a leap in 2 ways. First, the work is much less schematic and delineated, so you get forms that flow into each other, as they do on a living human body. And individual muscles are visible, but they're not unrelated to adjacent forms. And secondly, the anatomical details themselves are just more correct. Ears are no longer just sort of circular discs, and eyes are not just big, large, sort of almond shapes. The navel is not merely just a hole in the middle of the belly. It's got that little fold of skin, as we generally find on the living subject. The spine is no longer just a central groove running down the middle of the back. It now has a true S-curve, complete with a sacrum, which was generally missing in earlier Kuroi. And then, finally, just a few decades later, from about 520 to 485, we have the final and most developed stage of the archaic Kuros. As we see in the Aristodikos Kuros, which you can see at the image gallery, there's relatively little difference between this last stage of the archaic period and examples we might find coming from a contemporary figure modeling class. The figure is finally understood as a complete and harmonious whole. Proportion is pretty much nailed, and human anatomy has been thoroughly understood and rendered, though not always perfectly. Some aspects of these figures remain stylized, but in comparison to earlier archaic work, it's just light years ahead of them. And for the first time in history, we see something that we can recognize as a skilled attempt to portray humanity as it exists in nature. Not a conception of man, not an illustration meant to represent man, but the product of the observation of man. And this, finally, is what separates Greek art from every other culture's art in history up to that point. This is what art historian Ernst Gombrich called the Greek Revolution, the Great Awakening, what other historians call the Greek miracle, and what still others refer to as Greeks' quote, discovery of nature. This is why the Greeks are the root of the Western European tradition in sculpture, because they chose to value the representation of humanity as it appears in nature above all other conceptual constructs. In the Greek world and in no other culture, fidelity to nature in art became a prime virtue. So, there's the three-word answer I promised you 40 minutes ago. Why Greece? Fidelity to nature. I could have just told you fidelity to nature right off the bat and made this a 5-minute episode, but it's not enough to know that the answer to why Greece is fidelity to nature. You have to know why fidelity to nature is the answer, and now we can clearly see why. The so-called cult of beauty, with its origins in religion and its implicit benefits to small warring city-states in maintaining a strong militaristic population, that cult of beauty turned the Greeks into knowledgeable connoisseurs of the young, athletic male figure. At the same time, the conception of the gods as having human yet perfect form, as opposed to having an unknowable and unreproducible form, this encouraged artists to strive to discover what that form might look like. The obvious first step towards rendering the god Apollo, the greatest Kuros, would be to take pains to faithfully reproduce the living bodies that closest exemplified that ideal. In a culture that equates beauty with virtue, with goodness, searching for a physical ideal is an act of religious piety. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. I'm really excited about the podcast episodes to come. I'm learning so much cool stuff, and I'm excited to share it with you guys. So if you can't wait and you want to learn more on your own, I highly recommend a few sources that I've been relying on. One is the work of Nigel Spivey, and it's a book simply called Greek Sculpture. It's a fantastic and very readable overview of the entirety of the subject, and it's my primary source for most of the podcasts so far. Another book is called 100 Greek Sculptures, Their Careers and Extant Works, and this is by Andrew Stewart, and I actually recommend anything by Andrew Stewart. It's available for free online, this particular book, as well, so check it out there. And I see both Spivey's and Stewart's name in bibliographies and footnotes in just about everything I read about Greek sculptors. So it's good stuff and reliable info. So don't forget, you can check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, or at our YouTube channel and at our Facebook group page. And while you're there, you can join in the conversation with more than 1,000 other listeners. Feel free to ask me a question, post an interesting link, show off your work, or just bask in the fellowship of like-minded people. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or, the dozens of other podcast apps out there, and receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device as soon as new episodes air. And if you want to help the podcast reach other people, you can leave a review or give the podcast a rating wherever you subscribe. Also, as always, at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can stream the complete archives of the show. You can check out the image galleries for this and other episodes, and you can support the podcast by buying some Sculptor's Funeral merchandise or by making a donation. Hey, there's an idea. And finally, you can click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies, at thesculptorsfuneral.com. Because clicking on that link and buying from Blick helps to support the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.